Thank you, Les Cancorla, and I welcome the opportunity to speak on this piece of legislation. Minister, the legislation in front of Les Cancorla Gamaleshkel, I think it should be fair no made.
Yeah.
So the legislation that's in front of us, the finance state guarantees, international financial institution funds and miscellaneous provisions bill, covers three main areas, one of which I want to focus on, and that's in relation to the new legislative provision to facilitate entry into a contribution agreement with international financial institutions, also known as multilateral development banks, namely the European Investment Bank, the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and the Council of Europe Development Bank, enabling a contribution to a trust or donor fund to be established by them for the purposes of responding to a particular crisis. Minister, I'm proposing that a specific fund would be established under this legislation to address a specific crisis, namely the climate emergency, with specific reference to its impact on migration, which the EU itself has defined as a crisis. Now, Minister, according to the World Bank, the pandemic has pushed an additional 100 million people into extreme poverty. Furthermore, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development reports that foreign direct investment flows have declined by 35% in developing countries compared to a reduction of 12% in developed countries. And as you know, the ongoing war in Ukraine continues to cast its shadow, increasing global economic uncertainty and adversely affecting global trade and investment flows. This disruption caused by the war has also helped push the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's food price index in 2022 to its highest level since 1961. The slow and halting recovery from COVID-19 pandemic has run up against the high food and energy prices driven by Russia's war in Ukraine, as well as the escalating impacts of climate change. Alongside the elevated debt servicing levels, local currency devaluation and higher capital costs has disproportionately distressed the lower middle income countries' economies, while also facing the prospect of slowing global economy. These shocks have weakened economic growth and ballooned debt burdens. Urgent action, I believe, is now needed to immediately help the lower middle-income countries to restore debt sustainability and mobilise resources to achieve a shared development and climate change goals that we all aspire to. Minister, as I stand here, 47 heads of state and government from across the European continent are meeting as part of the European political community in Granada in Spain. They're meeting with the European Council members who have at the top of their agenda a plan to manage inward migration, which it sees as a major challenge facing the continent. The facts are that the main drivers of this migration is either directly or indirectly attributed to both economic and climate challenges. And while we in Europe will try to build our walls higher and try to redistribute inward migration across Europe for those who manage to scale those walls, Minister, the best and most effective way to address this issue is to ensure that people are not forced to leave their homelands in the first place. I've been engaging with young members of Parliament from Egypt, Ghana, Indonesia and Senegal, who, along with academic experts and climate-focused organisations, are committed to improving the economic and social well-being of the Global South and the lower middle-income countries. They are requesting greater support for the Global South countries and lower middle-income countries to drive the climate change agenda. Their generation is acutely aware of the pressing challenges posed by climate change. They have grown up witnessing its devastating impacts on communities, on ecosystems and their economies. From extreme weather events to food insecurity, from rising sea levels to the displacement of citizens. The climate crisis is not a distant threat, but a stark reality that affects each and every one of us. They represent nations with heavy debt burdens, which as a result leaves them facing a very slow green transition. They're seeking action from the international community and from us as Europeans for just climate financing. The Ubuntu Initiative for climate financing is a proposal that these 4 young parliamentarians have put forward. They chose the name Ubuntu, which is a South African phrase that means "I am because you are," to signify the importance of working together as humans in facing the climate change risks that we all are trying to address. The initiative has been supported by more than 45 countries from the Global South and Ukraine as a lower middle-income country. They're proposing under this initiative 3 things. First of all, debt swaps for climate with a special focus on adaptation, which will have the dual benefit of providing debt relief and spurring climate action. This measure will help to alleviate the burden of debt on lower and middle-income countries, allowing them to focus on building resilient economies and societies, engaging in global trade and contributing to the global climate and sustainability goals. Secondly, lower middle-income countries' common framework for debt relief, similar to the G20 common framework for lower income countries. This framework for debt relief for lower middle-income countries will help these countries to deal with the fiscal tightness and protracted liquidity problems. It will also ensure that these countries are not burdened with unsustainable debt and that can impede their ability to respond to the urgent challenges of climate change, as well as economic and social development. And thirdly, that the International Monetary Fund surcharges policy must be immediately suspended and eventually eliminated in the upcoming review. These additional charges on top of basic interest rate fees have placed an unfair burden on vulnerable countries that are in need of financial support. Alleviation of the debt pressures ensures smooth transition to a green economy. Minister, in light of the global challenges, they are deeply concerned about the impact of COVID-19 and the ongoing war in Ukraine on the economies of the countries that they represent, the lower middle-income countries. These 2 shocks have resulted in a sharp decline in economic activity, in job losses, in inflation, rising food prices, all of which leads to increased poverty levels. And this, Minister, forces people to migrate, leading to the very issue that the European Summit is trying to address as we speak. As a result, there is a need to provide greater support to the Global South countries and lower middle-income countries by prioritising these key 3 points. Minister, we will send representatives to the World Bank and International Monetary Fund meeting in Marrakesh next week. And I'm asking you, Minister, to ensure that our delegation supports the Ubuntu Initiative, supports these young parliamentarians across the world to actually get a fair write-down of debt in conjunction with stimulating their own indigenous economies and addressing the climate challenges that they are facing in reality on the ground in their countries and across their regions. And Minister, the reality is that that debt today is stopping innovation. It's stopping opportunity, and it is forcing the best people in those countries to up and leave and come to Europe for a better life. It's a compounding the economic stagnation that many of these countries are facing at the moment. And it's leaving these countries with a lack of funding to address the climate challenge that has been caused by us here in the developed world. And while funding has not been forthcoming from us in the developed world to create a new fund in which countries responsible for high carbon emissions would compensate vulnerable countries that have suffered from the climate impacts, here is an opportunity for us to come up with an innovative measure of debt forgiveness that would support climate change and the delivery of constructive climate change initiatives that we're all talking about. It would support sustainable investment in countries that have been hamstrung up to now because of the levels of debt that they have been trying to manage. And the Ubuntu Initiative is coming from these communities. It's coming from these countries, and it's coming from the future leaders of our nations, the young parliamentarians across these countries. So we're not only supporting the breaking out of the constraints that have been created through debt for various reasons, some of which, as we know, has been because of poor governance in these countries, which has been facilitated by many of our colleague countries here in the developed world, and many of the regimes here have supported that level of debt creation in some of those countries. On top of that, what we have done in terms of carbon emissions has compounded the climate problems that they're facing. And while we are concerned about global stagnation in terms of the world economy and the impact that it has here in relation to GDP and GNP, it is having a devastating impact on food prices, on the viability of many of these economies, and as a result of that, these countries cannot service the levels of debt that they're being asked to do. And then on top of that, we have the International Monetary Fund effectively putting debt penalties on top of interest rates to compound an already difficult problem. So, Minister, I'm asking that we here in Ireland would support the Ubuntu Initiative, that we would support it in two ways, that we would next week forcefully support these young parliamentarians when they propose this initiative at that meeting next week, but that we would also talk with our European colleagues about setting up a fund here in Europe that would help to deal with these challenges, would help to support driving innovative climate change measures in many of these countries, so that people have the opportunity to live and work in their own communities, in their own countries, rather than making a perilous journey across the Sahara Desert and then making a journey across the Mediterranean, which is nothing short of suicidal. And what really surprises me about all of this, Minister, is that when we listen to the interviews of these people that are on the banks of the Mediterranean Sea in North Africa, and they're very well aware of the risks that they face going across the Mediterranean. They see their neighbours and families losing their lives on the Mediterranean, and yet for them, they are prepared to take that risk, because that risk is better than the lack of any future that they have at the moment. And we, within our hands, control that future. We have the opportunity to drive innovative change by taking a more flexible approach in relation to the management of debt. We're not talking about writing off the debt. We're talking about seeing that debt being adapted in a different way to see investment, instead of paying off loans, investment being put into the economies of these countries, that drive sustainable development, that drive the green economy in these countries, meeting our global targets in terms of climate change and sustainability, as well as addressing the issue of migration, the issue, as I say, that the leaders all over Europe are looking at the moment. So I would ask you, Minister, to work with your European colleagues to support this initiative, and let's all of us together, collectively, make a real difference on a global level to the issue of climate change. Thank you.